I always thought rock bottom was something you felt, not something your own family would label you as, until the week before my wedding when my mother, my actual mother, looked at me with that tired, disappointed expression she'd perfected over the years and said, "Daniel, your wedding is a trivial event for someone at the bottom. We're not wasting time on it." I laughed at first because I thought it was just another one of those cutting jokes she made whenever she wanted to remind me that my older brother, Andrew, was the golden child and I was the barely keeping up son. But she wasn't joking. She wasn't even harsh about it. She said it casually, like she was telling me the weather. And when I looked around at my dad and my brother's wife, nobody disagreed. Nobody said, "Come on, that's too much." They all nodded, like skipping my wedding was some logical family decision. So I went home that night and told my fiancée, Emily, and instead of getting angry like I expected, she just hugged me tighter and said, "Well, then we'll make a wedding that doesn't need them." I didn't say it out loud, but some part of me kept hoping, stupidly, that they'd still show up. That maybe guilt or love or basic human decency would kick in. But when the day came and I stood there at the venue in my suit, watching other families arrive, watching parents tear up, watching siblings take pictures, my phone stayed completely silent. No missed calls. No messages. No, we're running late. Nothing. The first hit landed when the ceremony was supposed to start, and I kept glancing at the door like some abandoned kid who couldn't accept the truth. The second hit landed when one of Emily's aunts asked, "Where's your family, sweetheart?" in that soft, sympathetic tone that made me want to sink into the ground. But the knockout punch, the one that changed everything, came an hour later when my best man tapped my shoulder and said, "Dude, you should probably see this." I took his phone, already bracing myself, and there it was on Instagram. A live video of my mother laughing in Hawaii, holding a coconut drink, with my brother's kids splashing in a pool behind her. My brother shouted to the camera, "Best family trip ever?" And then my mom added, "So much better than wasting time back home." The comments were full of goals and family first and all the fake happy emojis that people post to hide the ugliness behind their lives. And I just stared at the screen feeling something cold twist inside my chest. It wasn't just that they skipped my wedding, it was that they celebrated skipping it. They celebrated excluding me. They chose a vacation over their own son's marriage and bragged about it publicly. I can't explain how that moment felt except to say it was like being erased in real time. Like watching the people who are supposed to love you rewrite their story to pretend you didn't exist. But it didn't end there. Because it never ends with my family. They don't just hurt you, they circle back when they need something. Exactly 1 month later, I was eating breakfast with Emily, finally starting to feel a little normal again, when my phone rang. It was my mother. I stared at the screen for a full 10 seconds before answering, mostly because I wanted to see how she'd start. Would she apologize? Pretend nothing happened? Act confused? What she said was far worse. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask about the wedding. She didn't mention the Hawaii trip. Her exact first sentence, delivered with full urgency, like I'd done something wrong, was, "Daniel, the loan payments haven't been made. We need you to handle it." I blinked because I had no idea what she was talking about. So she repeated it, louder, like my confusion was an inconvenience. "Daniel, the loan you signed for, to help the family, those payments are late." I felt my stomach drop. "What loan?" I asked. "The loan your father opened under your name," she snapped. "The one you agreed to help with for your brother's business." Except I never agreed. I never signed anything. I never even heard about this loan. They used my name. They used my credit. They used my identity and said nothing. And now, suddenly, their little financial fire was my responsibility to put out. I let her talk for a long time, mostly because I wanted to hear how far she'd go. She told me she'd been too stressed to call earlier. She said she didn't want drama on my wedding day, as if her absence hadn't already created the biggest drama possible. She said they needed me to step up like a real son. And while she said all of this, I remembered standing in my suit alone. I remembered the Hawaii video. I remembered the years of being the backup child who only mattered when he was useful. And in that moment, something inside me didn't break. It hardened. Cleanly. Quietly. like a door finally shutting. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I didn't explain. I just repeated the exact words she had said to me a month earlier, the words that had burned into my memory. Mom, please don't contact me about trivial matters. The silence on the other end wasn't confusion, it was panic. The kind of panic that comes when a manipulator realizes their puppet just cut the strings. She started stuttering, asking what I meant, asking if I was joking, but I didn't stay on the line long enough to explain. I hung up. I blocked her number. Then I blocked my dad. Then my brother. Then his wife. For the first time in my life, I felt something close to freedom. But freedom doesn't come quietly in families like mine. It comes with consequences. And what happened after that phone call? The things they did, the lies they spread, the lengths they went to proved that cutting them off was only the beginning of a much bigger war. When I hung up on my mother that day, I thought cutting them off would give me peace, or at least distance, but I underestimated how people like my family react when they lose control over the one person they always treated like a backup generator, silent, available, and expected to turn on the moment they needed something. The very next morning, before I even had a chance to fully process what had happened, Emily nudged me awake and said, "Your dad's at the door." I wasn't ready for that. I thought blocking them meant I wouldn't see them, not that they'd show up unannounced like they own the place. When I opened the door, my dad, Mike, stood there with the same stiff, disappointed expression he wore my entire childhood, like just looking at me reminded him of something he regretted. But this time his eyes were different, not angry, not sad, just desperate. He didn't even say hello before shoving a stack of papers toward my chest and growling, "Fix it." No explanation, no apology, nothing. Just fix it, as if I owed them my entire existence. I didn't take the papers. Instead, I stepped back and said, "You can't be here." And he pushed against the door like he planned to force his way in. Emily had to step between us and tell him to leave or she'd call the police. And only then did he realize that the same quiet kid he'd controlled for decades wasn't standing in front of him anymore. He left, but not peacefully. He left shouting threats about how I wouldn't survive without this family, and how ingratitude destroys people. 2 days later, the messages started. Not from them. Those numbers were blocked, but from random cousins, old family friends, even people I hadn't spoken to since high school. Why would you abandon your parents? Why would you refuse to help your own brother? Why are you making trouble over some misunderstanding? Each message was worded differently, but the tone was the same: blaming, shaming, cornering. My mother had clearly gone into full victim mode, telling everyone that I'd cut the family off over nothing and refused to help with a small loan, leaving out the part where they opened debt under my name without my permission. My brother, Andrew, apparently told people that I ruined his business opportunities by refusing to step up as a real man. And the worst part? People believed them. Because that's how my family always operated. They built their image long before they ever let anyone see their truth. They were the perfect family, the church-going family, the successful family. Meanwhile, I'd always been the quiet, avoid conflict one. So when they painted me as the villain, people nodded along like it made perfect sense. But what they didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that 2 weeks before the wedding, I'd finally landed a major promotion at my job, one that bumped my income far beyond what my family assumed I earned. I didn't celebrate it publicly because I knew exactly how they'd react. They didn't like me succeeding unless they could control it, benefit from it, or claim credit for it. If they had known I was finally financially stable, really stable, they would have drained me dry before the wedding, not after. And I guess their biggest mistake was assuming I was still the son who'd drop everything to rescue them. So while they were telling the world I abandoned them, I quietly contacted a lawyer. When I explained the loan situation, the identity use, the forged signatures, the fraudulent application, the lawyer told me something that changed the entire direction of the story. "Daniel, this isn't a family issue. This is a crime." Hearing that word, crime, did something to me. It validated every gut instinct I'd ignored for years. My family didn't just hurt me emotionally, they exploited me financially, knowingly, intentionally. So, I asked the lawyer what my options were. He told me I could file a fraud report, freeze the account, and pursue legal action. But he also warned me that once I did, the fallout would be nuclear. Not just arguments, not just angry messages. Full destruction of whatever fragile illusion remained between me and them. And I had to decide whether I wanted peace or justice. For the first time in my life, I chose justice. We froze the loan. The bank flagged the fraud. My credit was protected. And my family? Well, that's when things really spiraled for them. Within a week, I heard through a distant cousin, one of the few who actually believed me, that the bank had contacted my parents. They showed up demanding proof I'd signed the documents. My mother apparently broke down screaming that Daniel is doing this out of spite, while my dad kept insisting, he's lying, he agreed verbally. But verbal agreements don't override forged signatures. My brother, the golden child, suddenly wasn't so golden. His business, still struggling after multiple failed attempts, had been counting on that loan. Without it, he defaulted on 2 other small loans. His wife started panicking that they'd lose their house. And my mother? She played the martyr card so hard you'd think she'd been left at the altar, not the one who skipped a wedding. But here's the thing about people who manipulate, they get angry when their manipulation stops working. Then they get vicious. The next storm came when someone posted a long rant about me in the family Facebook group run by my aunt. I wasn't in it anymore, but screenshots always find their way back. The post said I was selfish, ungrateful, mentally unstable, and brainwashed by my new wife. They claimed Emily was turning me against the family and that I had abandoned responsibilities like a child. They attacked our marriage. They attacked my character. They even implied I was using drugs, which was insane. My idea of being wild is ordering food past midnight. It was all lies, but familiar lies, the kind my mother used whenever she needed to destroy someone's credibility before they exposed her behavior. Emily, though, wasn't having it. She told me, if they're willing to go this far publicly, imagine what they'd do privately. And that's when she suggested something I hadn't considered before. Maybe it's time we tell the truth. I resisted at first. I didn't want drama. I didn't want a war. But the longer I stayed silent, the more they twisted the narrative. And when I got a call from an unknown number from my brother's wife sobbing and saying, "You're ruining everything, Daniel," I realized staying quiet made me complicit in their lies. So I decided if they wanted a villain, I'd give them the truth. Not anger. Not revenge. Just the facts they tried so hard to hide. That decision, choosing to expose everything, became the turning point. Because once you shine a light on people who've lived in shadows, they either run or attack. And what my family did next proved they were willing to scorch every bridge, every relationship, every shred of dignity just to keep controlled. I thought exposing the truth would be simple. Lay out the facts, clear my name, and move on, but I should have known better. Nothing is ever simple with a family that survives by rewriting reality. When I decided to finally speak up, I didn't post a rage-filled rant or some emotional meltdown. I wrote a calm, detailed message and sent it privately to a handful of relatives I trusted just enough to believe they wouldn't twist it instantly. In it, I explained the forged loan, the fraudulent signatures, the skipped wedding, the Hawaii vacation, the threats at my door, and how every time I'd tried to set boundaries in the past, they'd responded with manipulation or punishment. I didn't insult anyone. I didn't exaggerate anything. I simply told the truth. And within 15 minutes, 15, not an hour, not a day, my aunt sent me a screenshot showing my message had already been forwarded dozens of times. My mother didn't even pretend to defend herself. She went straight into attack mode, telling everyone I was fabricating lies to justify abandoning my family and that Emily had poisoned my mind. She said I was unstable, dangerous, and seeking revenge for imaginary childhood trauma. She even dragged up old stories from when I was 12 or 13, twisting normal kid mistakes into proof that I had always been a problem. When Emily read those messages, she looked physically sick. Not because she cared what they thought, she didn't, but because she finally saw with her own eyes the part of my childhood I rarely talked about. The next blow came from my brother, Andrew, who apparently felt the need to perform his outrage publicly. He posted a long, self-righteous rant on Facebook that started with, "I never wanted to bring family issues online, but Daniel has forced my hand," and went on to list all the ways I had let the family down. According to him, I had refused to be part of family responsibilities, never supported his business ventures, embarrassed the family repeatedly, and now I was trying to destroy everything they built out of jealousy. Jealousy. That man genuinely believed I, someone who worked hard to build a stable life, would be jealous of him, a 36-year-old who'd burned through 3 businesses, borrowed money from everyone, and still lived off my parents. But manipulation thrives in confidence, and he delivered the speech like he was some wounded hero. What made the whole thing darker was the comment section. Dozens of relatives and family friends calling me ungrateful, selfish, disrespectful, immature, dramatic. One comment actually said, "Daniel always seemed off to me." I'm not surprised he turned out this way. People who hadn't spoken to me in 15 years felt entitled to diagnose my life suddenly. And to my mother's delight, their pity poured onto her like warm rain. "You don't deserve this, sweetie. Some kids are just lost causes. You raised him right. He made his own choices." But here's where things shifted. Because despite all the noise, despite the smear campaign, there were cracks in their perfect facade, cracks that only needed a little pressure to split wide open. The first crack came from my cousin Jason, who called me the same night the posts went up. Jason was the quiet, observant type, the kid who always saw more than he let on. He told me he didn't believe a word my family posted and said, "Daniel, they did the same thing to my sister when she stopped giving them money. They cut her out and told everyone she was unstable." That sentence hit me harder than any insult my family threw at me. It meant this wasn't a one-time betrayal. It was a pattern. A system. Something they'd perfected long before they targeted me. It also meant Jason's sister had walked the same road, alone, thinking she was the problem. And that's when something inside me sharpened, not out of anger, but out of clarity. This wasn't about alone. This wasn't about a wedding. This wasn't even about me. This was about power. My family ran on control, and the moment you refused to play your assigned role, they rewrote your entire character to justify cutting you out. The second crack came a few days later when Emily received a message from Andrew's wife, Rebecca. At first, I thought it was going to be another guilt trip or attack, but the message was surprisingly different. Rebecca wrote, "I'm sorry for everything. I can't defend what they're doing. Andrew asked me to block you, but I needed to tell you I know the loan wasn't yours." That line alone felt like a slap and a lifeline at the same time. She went on to explain how Andrew and my parents had talked about putting debts under my name since I didn't have kids and could handle it better, and that they'd planned to tell me once things settled. She said she didn't agree with it, but felt pressured to go along. She ended with, "Please don't tell them I reached out. I can't deal with the fallout." Reading that message was like someone finally turning the lights on in a dark room. It confirmed everything I suspected but hadn't been able to prove, that they never saw me as family, just a safety net they could stretch until it tore. And just when I thought the situation couldn't get messier, the third crack hit, this time from the bank. They called me, not my parents, not Andrew, but me, informing me that the fraud investigation required a full review of the loan documents. They needed verification of signatures, communication records, and identities. And since the loan was in my name, I was the primary point of contact. I told them I had never seen or signed those documents, and when the representative sent me digital copies, seeing my own name forged with sloppy handwriting, it lit a fire in me I didn't know I had. The signature barely looked like mine. They didn't even try to mimic it properly. They assumed I would never see the papers. They assumed I would pay automatically. They assumed I would stay the same quiet, compliant son forever. That assumption was their fatal mistake. The bank informed me that because the loan was fraudulent, it would remain frozen until the investigation concluded, meaning Andrew's business was stuck in financial limbo and the house he and Rebecca lived in, partially tied to those financial documents, was at risk. I didn't take pleasure in that. I didn't celebrate it. But I also didn't feel guilty. Actions have consequences, and they were finally facing theirs. When the bank contacted my parents for their statements, my mother called from a different number, screaming at me for betraying the family. She accused me of humiliating them, destroying Andrew's future, and choosing money over blood. She demanded I call the bank, lie, and say I'd agreed to everything. I didn't even argue. I simply said, "You created this, not me," and hung up. Blocking her again felt like closing a book I should have stopped reading years ago. And yet, despite everything, despite the lies, the harassment, the humiliation, the real explosion hadn't even happened yet. Because the moment Andrew realized he could lose everything, he stopped hiding behind Facebook posts and excuses. Instead, he did something far worse. Something that proved just how far he was willing to go to drag me back under his control. Something that turned this entire situation from a family conflict into a full-blown war. I should have known Andrew wouldn't go down quietly. Men like him never do. When you take away their control, when you expose their lies, they don't stop, they escalate. And that escalation hit me on a Thursday morning when I walked out onto my porch and found an envelope taped to the door. The tape pressed so aggressively it ripped paint off when I pulled it off. Inside was a letter, not typed, not polite, handwritten in my brother's messy, angry scrawl. "You think you're better than us," it began, and that alone told me exactly where this was going. The letter went on to accuse me of trying to embarrass the family publicly, attacking their livelihood, and destroying years of hard work. He claimed I was coached by Emily, that I always wanted to make the family look bad, and that if his business collapsed, it would be my fault for being selfish. But the last paragraph was the part that made my hands shake, not with fear, but with the realization of just how unhinged he'd become. He wrote, "If you don't fix this, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. I'll make you regret this. Don't test me, Daniel." There was no signature, but it didn't need one. I would have recognized that level of entitlement anywhere. I showed the letter to Emily, and she didn't say a word. She just grabbed her phone and took pictures of it. "You're not dealing with this alone," she said quietly. But even then, even while reading a threat from my own brother on my front porch, I still underestimated how far he'd go. Because a letter was only the beginning. 2 days later, I learned what real escalation looked like. It started with a call from my workplace's HR department. When I saw the number pop up, confusion washed over me. I had no disciplinary issues, no conflicts, nothing. I'd always been the quiet, reliable employee who stayed out of drama. So when HR asked me to come in as soon as possible for a mandatory meeting, my stomach twisted. Emily insisted on driving me, and thank God she did, because the moment we walked in, I saw the printed packet sitting on the table and instantly understood. Andrew had tried to destroy my job. HR handed me the packet, 11 pages of emails sent from an anonymous account, accusing me of fraud, harassment, substance abuse, and violent outbursts. The emails claimed I was unstable, dangerous, and emotionally abusive toward coworkers, even suggesting I should be monitored because of my history. They painted me as someone who needed intervention. The kicker? Attached were screenshots of fake conversations, badly edited, obviously fabricated, where I supposedly admitted to drug use and wanting to sabotage my company. Whoever made them didn't even try to match my writing style. They were so clumsy it would have been laughable if the situation weren't so serious. But the moment HR asked, "Is there anyone who might hold a personal grudge against you?" the truth hit me so hard I felt dizzy. This was all Andrew. This was retaliation, pure and simple. This was him trying to destroy my life because I'd stopped letting him use it. Thankfully, my employer took the claims seriously, but not blindly. They investigated, reviewed my spotless record, and by the end of the meeting, HR said, "We don't believe these allegations, but whoever sent them intends to harm you." It should have comforted me, but all I felt was a rising, creeping dread. If Andrew was willing to contact my workplace and manufacture an entire persona to get me fired, what wouldn't he do next? Emily, sitting beside me with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, leaned over and whispered, "This is no longer a family problem. This is harassment." And she was right. I tried to handle everything quietly. I tried to protect the truth without escalating anything. But Andrew wasn't just fighting for money. He was fighting to win, to maintain dominance, to prove that without the family, I was nothing. It was never about the loan, it was about power. Things only escalated from there. That weekend, Emily and I were at a grocery store when a woman approached us, one of my mother's friends, someone I barely recognized, who immediately started berating me in the middle of the aisle. "How dare you do this to your mother?" she snapped. "She's crying every night because of you. You've turned into a monster." Shoppers stared, employees paused to listen, and I stood there frozen because I genuinely didn't know what she was talking about. Emily stepped in front of me and said, "Ma'am, you need to step back." But the woman kept going, listing off lies my mother had told her, that I'd cursed at her, that I'd abandoned the family in their time of need, that I'd stolen money, that I was refusing to help while Andrew's children were suffering. That one, the part about the kids, was the kind of emotional manipulation my mother excelled at. She'd always weaponized guilt like a master craftsman. The woman eventually stormed off after shouting, "You'll regret this, Daniel." But as Emily and I walked out of the store, I realized something important. This wasn't random. This was organized. My mother had recruited allies. She was building an army of perception, making sure the world saw her as a victim long before the truth could reach them. Emily suggested filing a restraining order. I wasn't ready yet. Some part of me was still trying to process the fact that my own family was willing to go this far. But the universe wasn't finished teaching me how wrong I was. 3 days later, around 9:45 p.m., we heard a loud knock. No, a pounding on the front door. My heart dropped because I knew exactly who it was before I even checked the peephole. Andrew. He was on the porch, pacing, fists clenched, face red. He looked like a man who'd spent hours building up anger just to unleash it. Emily grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do not open that door." But I already knew that. I went to the door, but not to open it, to record. Andrew shouted through the wood, demanding I fix the mess, yelling that I had ruined his business, and threatening that I would pay for this. He banged on the door hard enough that the hinges rattled. Neighbors came out to look. Someone shouted from across the street for him to leave before they called the police. But the most chilling part was the moment he dropped his voice low and said, "If you think you can cut this family out, you're dead wrong. You'll always be part of us, one way or another." It wasn't said like a threat, it was said like a promise. And that terrified me more than anything else. We called the police. They came. Andrew ran. They took statements, but explained that without physical contact or direct threats of bodily harm, there wasn't much they could do. It was infuriating. My brother had shown up at my house at night, pounded on my door, screamed threats, scared my wife, disturbed neighbors, and legally, it was just a family dispute. But that night was the breaking point for me. I looked at Emily, who sat on the couch shaking, and realized I couldn't protect both of us by hoping my family would magically stop. They wouldn't. They'd escalate until something irreversible happened. And I couldn't let that happen. So the next morning, I called my lawyer again. This time, I didn't ask for options. I said, "I want to take every action necessary. Because if my family wanted war, then for the first time in my life, I was willing to fight back. Not emotionally. Not through screaming matches. Through the law. Through documentation. Through consequences they never imagined I'd have the strength to pursue." And the moment I made that decision, the moment I stood up not as the quiet, compliant son, but as someone done being used, everything changed. Permanently. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I saw was the unread notification counter on my phone. 23 missed calls, 11 voicemails, and a string of messages long enough to scroll for almost a full minute. All of them from my family. It was like they had collectively decided to launch an emergency operation to reel me back in, and the more I watched those messages pile up, the calmer I felt. Not because I enjoyed their panic, but because for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting out of obligation or fear. I was simply observing. Emily was still asleep beside me, her breathing soft and steady. I cracked open the bedroom door and stepped into the hallway so I wouldn't wake her, then finally pressed play on the first voicemail. It was my dad, his voice strained, irritated, but purposely controlled, like he was trying to sound reasonable. He said things like, "We need to talk, and you can't keep acting childish," and there's a real issue that needs your attention." The phrase "your attention" made me snort. The only time I ever mattered to them was when something needed fixing. I deleted the voicemail and moved to the next one. This one was from my mom, but unlike before, she wasn't angry. She sounded scared. Her usually sharp voice shook as she explained that the bank had issued a formal notice. Payments were late. The loan was flagged. Penalties were stacking up. And then she said something that made me pause. "If they start digging, we're going to be in trouble."
Digging.
That wasn't a word my mom used lightly. She had always been good at hiding things, finances, family issues, anything that threatened the perfect image she tried to sell to the world. Hearing real fear in her voice set off an instinct I hadn't felt in years. But I didn't call her back. I wasn't ready. Instead, I listened to the third voicemail, my brother, Michael, the golden child himself. The same brother who happily took the Hawaii trip while pretending my wedding didn't exist. He sounded furious, like he couldn't believe I was still ignoring them. "Dude, stop being dramatic," he said. "We're in a jam. Just help out like you always do." That line, "like you always do," felt like a key sliding into a lock. That was the problem. I always did. I always bailed them out. I always put myself last. I always swallowed the disrespect, the dismissiveness, the emotional manipulation because they were family. But when your own family tells you your wedding is trivial, that you're at the bottom, that you don't matter, not once but repeatedly, what are you supposed to feel? Loyalty? Gratitude?
No.
At some point, the leash they tie around your neck snaps, and you finally realize you were never a son. They made you a servant. I put the phone down and made coffee, trying to keep my mind from spiraling. But as I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from my mug, something clicked. I didn't know exactly what they were hiding, but I suddenly understood something. This loan situation wasn't just a missed payment. Something deeper was wrong. Something they didn't want exposed. Emily walked in a few minutes later, rubbing her eyes. "You're up early," she said, noticing the look on my face. "Let me guess, more calls?" "A lot," I said quietly. "And something's off. My mom said they're scared of the bank digging." Emily sat across from me. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," I said. "But I think there's more going on than they're telling me." She took my hand. "Whatever it is, it's not your responsibility to fix." "I know," I said. And I meant it. But curiosity, mixed with years of suppressed anger, was starting to pull me in a new direction. Not to save them, but to find out the truth they never wanted me to know. The storm broke later that afternoon. I was at work when my phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a call. It was an email. From a name I'd never seen before. The subject line was simple. "Regarding your family's loan." I opened it. My blood ran cold. The message was from a bank officer, requesting my confirmation on several payments made using my financial information. Payments authorized years ago under the claim that I agreed to be a cosigner. Except I never did. I never signed anything. I never gave permission. I never even knew my name was attached to their loan. My heart pounded. Hands shaking, I scrolled down. Attached were digital copies of forms with my signature, except the signature wasn't mine. It was forged. My own family had used my identity to secure a loan. A big one. And now it was unraveling. My vision blurred as a mix of rage and disbelief washed over me. They hadn't just skipped my wedding. They hadn't just dismissed me as worthless. They had literally used me illegally to prop up their finances. They treated me like a safety net because, in their minds, I wasn't a person. I was a resource.
A tool.
A backup plan. A wallet. I forwarded the email to myself, then to a secure folder, then to a lawyer's office I'd hired months ago for unrelated work. I needed to make sure I had everything documented in case things got worse. And they were about to. Because 30 minutes later, my phone rang again, this time from an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello." Silence for a moment. Then a voice I knew better than my own. My mother. But she didn't sound angry. She didn't sound guilty. She sounded terrified. "We need to talk," she whispered.
"Please."
It's about your grandmother's house." My stomach dropped. My grandmother, the one person who had ever treated me with real affection, had left her house to me when she passed away. My parents had always hated that fact. What about the house? I asked, my voice low. We used it, she said shakily, as collateral. I froze. The world tilted. You what? We didn't think anything would happen, she cried. We thought we could keep up with the payments. We thought you'd help, like you always do. There it was again. Like you always do. My grandmother's house. My identity. My signature. All used without my consent. And for what? A vacation? My brother's new truck? The constant spending they refused to control? Something inside me snapped in that moment. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a rope finally giving way after years of tension. Mom, I said slowly, I'm not helping you anymore. You can't say that, she stammered. We need you. No, I said. You needed a scapegoat. And you used me. She started crying, but there was no remorse in it. Only fear of consequences. Only fear of being caught. Please, she begged. If the bank seizes the house, then they seize it. Her breath hitched. You wouldn't do that to us. You already did it to me, I said. And for the first time in my entire life, she had no answer. But while I hung up and walked out of my office, heart pounding, one thing became painfully clear. The real fallout hadn't even begun yet. Because once the bank dug deeper, they weren't the only ones who would be exposed. My entire family was about to unravel, and the truth waiting for me in the middle of it was far darker than the loan, the house, or the forgery. It was the reason they had always treated me like I didn't matter. The reason they skipped my wedding. The reason they wanted me at the bottom. By the time I realized the magnitude of what my family had done, I knew this wasn't just about money, loans, or skipped weddings anymore. It was about control, reputation, and secrets so carefully buried that any exposure would shatter their entire image. The lawyer I hired had already begun piecing together everything. Forged signatures, the loan fraud, the collateral abuse with my grandmother's house, and now, through whispers from distant cousins and friends who had witnessed long-forgotten family dealings, other skeletons that my parents and Andrew had been hiding for decades. It was like uncovering a hidden ecosystem of lies. I spent days reviewing emails, documents, and financial statements, and each piece made me more certain of one thing. My family had never seen me as a son. I was an asset, a convenience, a scapegoat, and now, finally, I had proof. It started with a call from my attorney. Daniel, you need to hear this, he said gravely. He had obtained copies of agreements and communications between my parents and Andrew that I hadn't seen, emails in which they explicitly discussed using me as a fallback in case Andrew's ventures failed, instructions on how to keep me quiet, and even strategies to spin the narrative publicly if anything went wrong. They had literally planned to set me up to take the fall while they enjoyed vacations, business perks, and the illusion of being the perfect family. I sat there, stunned, staring at the screen, unable to believe I had lived through decades of manipulation without realizing it was intentional. And the more I uncovered, the more I understood why they had skipped my wedding. They didn't just want to humiliate me, they wanted to prove to everyone else that I was irrelevant, that I was weak, that I would never stand up for myself, that I would always let them win. My mother's Hawaii posts weren't just selfish, they were a demonstration, a signal, a way to say, this is our world. You don't belong. And then came the threatening emails and the attempts to ruin my career, which suddenly made complete sense. They were trained manipulators, and the moment I refused to bend, they escalated. I remember sitting in my living room with Emily beside me, showing her every email, every forged signature, every secret they had tried to keep. She was quiet for a long time, then whispered, "They really thought you'd keep quiet forever." And for the first time, I realized that silence had always been my weakness. Their entire power depended on it. But I wasn't silent anymore. Over the next week, I carefully began contacting distant family members who had always been excluded from the manipulation, people who had witnessed incidents that my parents had brushed under the rug. They had stories about Andrew's reckless business failures, my mother's interference in other family members' finances, and lies they had told about me being irresponsible. I documented everything, organizing it meticulously with my attorney. We even discovered that some of the documents used to forge my signature had been notarized improperly, legally. This meant my family could face serious criminal charges. The realization hit me hard. The very people who called my wedding trivial were now standing on the edge of legal disaster, and I held all the cards. I didn't feel victorious yet, only sober, precise, focused. And that focus was interrupted by an unexpected message from my grandmother's lawyer. She had been unaware that her house was used as collateral and was furious. She demanded immediate action to protect her estate. I forwarded everything to her legal team. Her message was short and sharp. Daniel, thank you. I always knew you were the responsible one. Don't let them take what's yours or mine. Her words hit me in a way my own mother never had. She believed in me, always had, and now she was an ally in exposing the truth. That evening, my mother called again, this time from a blocked number. Panic radiated from every syllable. Daniel, you can't do this. Please, we can fix it privately. Don't involve the bank. Don't involve anyone. I remained calm. Mom, you involved me. You crossed every line. This isn't private anymore. She screamed, then hung up. I realized at that moment the scale of what I had uncovered. This wasn't just a family feud. It was decades of abuse, manipulation, and fraud. I had been treated like the bottom for my entire life, used as a tool, and now I was finally seeing it clearly. I spent the next days preparing for the fallout, documenting every conversation, every email, and every message. The pressure mounted when my brother sent a text attempting to intimidate me again, threatening financial ruin and claiming he had friends who could make my life miserable. I simply forwarded the message to my attorney. Legal consequences were real, enforceable, and now unavoidable. Emily held my hand and said, "You're finally standing up to them. You can't imagine how proud I am of you." And I realized she was right. For the first time, I wasn't the powerless son at the bottom. I was a man who understood exactly what my family was capable of and had the means, the proof, and the clarity to confront it. But the most shocking revelation came unexpectedly. A distant cousin, the one I trusted most, sent me a scanned envelope of old letters from my mother and Andrew that dated back nearly 20 years. In them, they discussed deliberately undermining my confidence, setting me up to fail in school, work, and personal relationships, all while publicly praising Andrew as the successful son. The letters outlined strategies to make me feel worthless, isolated, and dependent. Everything made sense now: the skipped birthday parties, the favoritism, the constant subtle criticisms. The wedding wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of decades of manipulation, designed to remind me of my place. Reading those letters, I felt anger, betrayal, and a kind of grim satisfaction all at once. I finally had the full picture, and with Emily by my side and my attorney preparing the legal steps, I realized I could finally take back control. I wasn't just going to expose their lies. I was going to dismantle the system of control they had built around me and force them to face consequences for everything they had done. And as I sat there, carefully cataloging every document, every email, and every confession, I understood one thing clearly. The people who had treated me like I didn't matter, who skipped my wedding, who used my identity and attempted to destroy my reputation, they had underestimated me. They had assumed that the quiet, compliant son would stay that way forever. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't that son anymore. I was someone they couldn't control, couldn't manipulate, and couldn't dismiss. And I was just getting started. After weeks of quietly gathering evidence and letting my family dig their own hole deeper and deeper, the moment of reckoning arrived. I had everything prepared: the forged loan documents, the notarization errors, the emails and letters detailing decades of manipulation, and the testimonies of relatives who had witnessed the abuse firsthand. I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. I arranged a meeting with my attorney and told Emily to be ready. Whatever happened next could get messy. On a Wednesday morning, my attorney called all the key parties to a mediated session at the law office. My parents, Andrew, and even Rebecca reluctantly agreed to attend, probably thinking they could intimidate me into backing down like they always had. They didn't know that I'd spent months building a solid case, documenting every detail, and preparing myself mentally to finally confront the family who had treated me like I was disposable. The moment they walked into the room, my mother's expression faltered, her confident, self-assured mask slipping for the first time in decades. My father looked stiff and tense, trying to hide the fact that he had no control over the situation anymore. Andrew tried to swagger in, like he had the upper hand, but there was a subtle hesitation in his eyes as he glanced at the stacks of papers my attorney had brought. Emily stood beside me, calm and collected, and I could feel her quiet strength radiating, giving me the courage I needed to speak. My attorney started with a neutral tone, reviewing the purpose of the meeting and the documents we had compiled. Then, he began laying out the details of the loan fraud, the forged signatures, the unauthorized collateral, and the financial risks my parents and brother had taken at my expense. Each point landed like a hammer. I watched as my mother's face paled and Andrew's hands twitched slightly. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. They had expected a fight, but they hadn't expected a meticulously documented case of legal exposure. The attorney then presented the letters and emails, showing how they had systematically undermined me over the years, manipulated public perception, and attempted to control my life. Every lie they had told, the stories of me being ungrateful, unstable, or selfish, was contradicted by evidence from relatives and my own records. As each piece of evidence was read aloud, tension built in the room. My mother's hands shook. She looked as if she might cry or collapse. Andrew's face reddened with fury, but I could see the flicker of fear behind it. Even Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, realizing that she had unknowingly been dragged into this web. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and calm. For years, I had been silenced, manipulated, and dismissed. Now, finally, I had the power to reclaim my life and expose the truth. My attorney then laid out the legal consequences if they refused to cooperate: immediate restitution of the misused funds, formal correction of the loan documents, and the possibility of criminal charges for fraud and forgery. The room went silent. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again. My father shifted in his chair, looking like he had just realized the rug had been pulled from under him. Andrew, usually the loudest and most aggressive, now sat stiffly, clearly calculating how much trouble he was in. Then I spoke. My voice was steady, calm, and deliberate. For years, I let this happen quietly. I let you use me as a scapegoat, a backup plan, and a source of money. I let you manipulate my life, ruin my confidence, and humiliate me publicly. I am done. The words hit the room with a weight that surprised even me. Emily squeezed my hand in support, and I drew strength from that simple gesture. My mother started to speak, attempting the old guilt-tripping tactics, but I interrupted.
No,
Not this time. The wedding, the vacations, the loans, the lies, they all end here. I am no longer at the bottom. I am no longer someone you can control. You have had your chance to manipulate me, and now I am taking back everything you took. My father tried to interject, but the attorney held up a hand, signaling him to remain silent. Andrew's eyes narrowed, his jaw tight. I could see the realization settling in. He had underestimated me, and now he had nothing. My attorney then outlined a plan for restitution and legal resolution, giving them clear deadlines and consequences if they refused. The mood in the room was tense, charged with anger, fear, and the weight of truth finally exposed. My family, who had always thrived on control, was now powerless. The most satisfying part was seeing their carefully constructed image crumble in real time. They couldn't manipulate, they couldn't intimidate, and they couldn't pretend this wasn't happening. The next few hours were a blur of negotiations, tense exchanges, and reluctant acknowledgments of wrongdoing. They tried small excuses, half-hearted denials, and veiled threats, but each one was countered by concrete evidence. By the time the meeting ended, a fragile agreement had been established. Full restitution of the fraudulent loan, correction of all legal documents, and acknowledgement of wrongdoing for my parents and Andrew. They left the office silently, broken in a way I had never seen before. For the first time, I felt a sense of closure. I wasn't just reclaiming money or documents. I was reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my identity. Emily and I stepped out of the office into the sunlight, and I realized that, finally, the oppressive shadow of my family's manipulation had lifted. For decades, I had been at the bottom, invisible, dismissed, and used. But now, standing there, I was not only recognized for who I truly was, I had finally enforced boundaries that could never be ignored again. And as we walked to the car, I knew that the journey wasn't just about money or legal victories. It was about reclaiming the respect and autonomy that had been denied to me my entire life. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I was free, and nothing they could say or do would take that away. I had survived their manipulation, exposed their lies, and, for the first time, my life was truly my own. After the office meeting, the fallout began almost immediately, and I watched it unfold like a slow-motion train wreck. Except this time, I wasn't on the tracks. I was safely on the sidelines, armed with truth and control. My parents retreated into silence, hiding behind feigned illness, exaggerated stress, and desperate attempts to manipulate anyone who would listen into taking their side. Andrew tried his usual tactics, boasting to friends, spreading half-truths, and claiming he was the victim of an ungrateful sibling, but his lies were transparent, and the more he tried to twist the story, the more obvious it became that he had orchestrated fraud and deceit for years. Even the distant relatives who had once ignored my complaints began to speak up, sharing memories of manipulation, favoritism, and the ways my family had systematically used and discarded members for their own benefit. It was incredible to watch decades of illusion shatter within hours. For the first time, people who had once been loyal to them started to see them for what they truly were: opportunists who had built an empire of control using fear, deception, and calculated cruelty. The bank finally began the formal investigation into the loan, confirming the forgery, and froze all accounts connected to Andrew and my parents. Legal notices were sent, and suddenly, the very people who had relied on me for decades found themselves scrambling. They called my attorney repeatedly, each time with more desperation and less composure, trying to negotiate, apologize, or threaten, but every move backfired. Emily and I watched quietly as their panic escalated, their perfectly polished image cracking into tiny fragments with every failed maneuver. And yet, the most satisfying part wasn't the legal victory or the looming consequences. It was the realization that their power over me was gone forever. They couldn't bully, guilt, or manipulate me again. Their control had been shattered, and no amount of crying, pleading, or posturing could restore it. I started to rebuild my life with a sense of freedom I had never experienced. No more whispered threats, no more emotional blackmail, no more pretending everything was fine to keep the peace. For the first time, I was truly living for myself, not for the expectations of people who had never truly cared about me. And while the legal processes continued, Emily and I moved forward, planning a life that was ours alone, choosing vacations together, investing in a home, and making decisions without fear of judgment or interference. My parents tried, in small, pitiful ways, to reinsert themselves into my life, texting, calling, showing up at my home, but I ignored them. Each time they tried to regain control, I simply reminded myself of everything I had endured, everything they had done, and the fact that I finally had proof that I was never wrong to stand up for myself. Slowly, the rest of my family began to see the truth. Some apologized quietly, some distanced themselves, and some realized that siding with Andrew and my parents had been a mistake. I let the relationships form naturally, choosing who deserved my trust and who didn't, and it was liberating. My life, once defined by their manipulation and control, was finally mine. And in the end, the irony wasn't lost on me. The wedding they dismissed as trivial had been the first real sign that I needed to claim my life on my own terms. That event, which they treated as insignificant, became the catalyst for exposing decades of lies, fraud, and abuse. I realized that standing up for myself wasn't just about money or reputation. It was about reclaiming identity, dignity, and self-respect. I didn't just win a legal battle. I won the ultimate victory over years of psychological manipulation, betrayal, and dismissal. And as Emily and I sat together one evening, looking over plans for our new home, I reflected on how far I had come. The family who had once dismissed me, humiliated me, and used me like a tool could no longer dictate my worth or my choices. For the first time, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. I had taken back control of my life, exposed the truth, and ensured that no one could ever take advantage of me again. The threat of intimidation, the smears, the forged documents, the skipped wedding, they all faded into the past. I had transformed from the quiet, compliant son into a man who knew his value, understood his boundaries, and was unafraid to defend them. And as the sun set over our new life together, Emily resting her head on my shoulder, I realized that freedom and self-respect were far more valuable than anything my family had ever tried to control. I wasn't at the bottom anymore. I was standing tall, unshaken, and finally, entirely free.